A peculiar silence had settled over Baker Street. Not the heavy, oppressive silence that precedes a storm, nor the hollow quiet of abandonment, but something rarer and more delicate, the silence of a city momentarily holding its breath. The last Tuesday of January in the year 1898 arrived without the customary gray weight of a London winter morning. Instead, a sharp, crystalline light broke through the gap in my bedroom curtains, casting a narrow blade of brilliance across the counterpane that seemed almost continental in its clarity, as though some benevolent hand had polished the sky overnight and left it gleaming. I lay still for a moment, as has become my habit in recent years. A former military man learns to inventory his surroundings upon waking, the temperature of the air, the quality of sound beyond the walls, the particular way a room breathes when it is safe. These days, the practice serves a gentler purpose. I am no longer listening for the crack of a Jezile rifle across an Afghan plain. I am simply allowing myself the quiet luxury of arriving slowly into the day, of feeling the familiar architecture of 221B assemble itself around me like a sentence finding its proper grammar. The sitting room, when I entered it, was touched everywhere by that unlikely winter sun. It fell in long, warm parallelograms across the carpet, illuminating the settled dust on Holmes's chemical apparatus and lending an almost golden quality to the scattered papers on the deal table. Mrs. Hudson had laid the breakfast things with her usual care: the silver rack of toast, the covered dish, the pot of coffee whose fragrance had likely been what truly woke me, though I preferred to credit the light. A small fire burned in the grate, not roaring, but conversational, the kind of fire that asks nothing of you but your company. Holmes had not yet appeared. This was not, in itself, unusual. My friend's relationship with morning was a complicated and deeply personal affair, governed by laws that bore no resemblance to those observed by ordinary men. He might rise at 4, having never slept, and be deep in monograph composition before the first milk cart rattled past our window. Or he might remain in his room until nearly noon, emerging with the particular gray complexion and distant manner that told me his mind had been traveling through territories I could not follow and would not have wished to. On this morning, however, I noted that his bedroom door stood slightly ajar, a detail so minor that most would dismiss it, but one that, in the precise domestic geography of our shared rooms, carried meaning. Holmes closed his door fully when sleeping. He left it open when awake and working. This intermediate state suggested a threshold I could not yet interpret. I seated myself at the breakfast table, poured my coffee, and opened the morning edition of the Times. The news, as ever, was a mixture of the consequential and the trivial. A diplomatic tension with France over some colonial matter, an unusually large bequest to the British Museum, the report of a warehouse fire in Bermondsey that had, mercifully, claimed no lives. I read without full attention, my physician's ear tuned instead to the sounds from beyond that half-open door. I heard the creak of a floorboard. Holmes was awake then, and standing. A drawer opened. A pause followed, longer than expected, and in that pause I detected something that made me set down my coffee cup with a care that surprised me. It was not a sound, precisely. It was the quality of the silence itself. In 20 years of intimate acquaintance with Sherlock Holmes, I had learned to read his silences as other men read faces. The silence of concentration was taut and electric. The silence of boredom was restless, punctuated by small violences against the furniture. The silence of satisfaction hummed. But this silence, this strange, suspended pause beyond the half-open door, possessed a quality I had never encountered in all our years together. It was the silence of a man who has reached for something on a familiar shelf and found the shelf bare, and who stands now with his hand still extended, unwilling to believe the evidence of his own empty fingers. I heard him move again, and I returned my gaze to the newspaper with the practiced casualness of a man who has learned that Holmes does not appreciate being observed in moments of uncertainty. Whatever I had sensed in that silence, It would do neither of us any good for him to know I had sensed it. The fire settled deeper into its coals. The winter light shifted by a degree. Somewhere below, Mrs. Hudson's tread crossed the downstairs hallway with the steady rhythm that had become, over the years, as much a part of the music of this place as Holmes's violin or the rattle of hansoms on the street outside. I turned a page of the newspaper and waited, and if my hand was not entirely steady as I reached again for my coffee, I persuaded myself it was only the cold. A hesitation at the threshold. He appeared in the doorway like a man stepping onto a stage whose play he could not quite remember. It was the smallest of things, a fractional delay between the moment his hand found the door frame and the moment his eyes found mine. But I have spent the better part of 2 decades studying Sherlock Holmes the way a navigator studies the stars, and I knew at once that something in the familiar constellation had shifted. He was dressed, though not with his usual precision. His cravat was knotted, but not arranged. His waistcoat hung unbuttoned. These were details a casual observer would not have registered, but to me they spoke of a morning routine that had been interrupted from within, not by any external event, but by some private disruption in the mechanism of habit itself. Holmes stood in the threshold of the sitting room and looked about him with an expression I can only describe as one of careful reconnaissance, the expression of a man confirming the identity of a place he ought to know, but for one vertiginous instant does not entirely trust. "Watson," he said, and the familiar baritone reassured me somewhat. Whatever the disturbance had been, his voice, at least, remained his own. "Good morning, Holmes. The coffee is still reasonably warm, and Mrs. Hudson has outdone herself with the kedgeree." He moved into the room with a studied ease that did not quite conceal its deliberateness and lowered himself into his customary chair. I watched him pour his coffee, the right hand steady, the movements economical, and I waited, because I had learned long ago that Holmes, like certain delicate chemical compounds, must not be agitated prematurely. It came with the lightness of a throwaway remark, almost lost beneath the clink of cup against saucer. "This street," he said, "remind me of its name." I looked up. His gray eyes were fixed upon the window, upon the sharp winter light falling across the familiar rooftops opposite, and his expression held nothing so dramatic as confusion. It was subtler than that, a kind of searching, as though he were running his fingers along a shelf of neatly ordered files and finding one, just one, fractionally out of place. "Baker Street," I said, keeping my voice as level as the breakfast table. "As it has been these 17 years. "Yes," he replied, "of course." And the faintest shadow of something, not embarrassment, Holmes was constitutionally incapable of embarrassment, but something closer to private alarm crossed his aquiline features before the mask resettled with its customary authority. He reached for the toast rack. He began to speak with perfect fluency about an article in yesterday's Lancet concerning the chemical properties of certain Sumatran plant alkaloids. Within the span of 3 sentences, he had deduced from the position of my teacup, the angle of the newspaper, and a small ink stain on my left cuff that I had been attempting to write a letter before breakfast and had abandoned the effort, all of which was perfectly correct. The engine of his mind, it seemed, was running at its usual extraordinary speed. But I am a physician before I am anything else, and a physician does not forget a symptom merely because it has resolved. As I watched Holmes butter his toast with the geometrical precision he brought to all things, I held that small, strange moment in my memory, the way one holds a worrying shadow on a lung radiograph, not with panic, but with the quiet, watchful gravity of a man who knows that even the finest instruments occasionally falter. The doorbell rang below, and both of us looked toward the sitting room door with the instinctive attention of men long accustomed to the unexpected. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps ascended the stairs with a pace that told me, before she spoke a single word, that the visitor was elderly, respectable, and expected to be received. The professor who lost a word. The man who entered our sitting room carried himself with the careful dignity of one who has spent a lifetime before audiences and has learned that presence is not a matter of volume, but of architecture. Professor Edwin Calloway was tall, taller than Holmes, which was unusual. But the years had begun their quiet work upon his frame, curving the broad shoulders inward, as though the weight of decades spent leaning over manuscripts had gradually reshaped him into a permanent posture of scholarly attention. His hair was white and fine, combed with a precision that spoke of long habit rather than vanity, and his hands, large, long-fingered, expressive hands, moved when he spoke the way a conductor's hands move during a familiar score, shaping the air into phrases. I placed his age at 72, perhaps 73. His clothing was of excellent quality but not recent acquisition. The wool of his overcoat had the soft, almost luminous patina that only years of careful brushing can produce, and his shoes, while beautifully maintained, had been resoled at least twice. Here was a man of modest academic means and immodest personal standards, and I found myself warming to him before he had completed his first sentence. "Mr. Holmes," he said, and his voice confirmed everything his appearance had suggested, measured, resonant, accustomed to precision. "I must thank you for agreeing to see me. I confess I was uncertain whether my difficulty would merit your attention. It is not a matter of stolen jewels or missing persons. It is, I fear, rather more peculiar than that." Holmes gestured toward the basket chair and regarded our visitor with the particular quality of stillness that indicated his full attention had been engaged. I had seen him dismiss clients within 30 seconds of their arrival. I had also seen him lean forward in that precise way, chin slightly raised, fingers steepled, eyes narrowed not with suspicion, but with the appetite of a mind that has scented something genuinely novel. "I am a linguist, Mr. Holmes. Or rather, I was. I retired from the Faculty of Languages at Oxford 4 years ago, though I confess retirement has not much altered my daily habits. I still read. I still correspond with former colleagues. I still think in etymologies." A faint, self-deprecating smile crossed his face. "Language has been not merely my profession, but my dwelling place. I have lived inside words the way other men live inside houses." He paused, and in that pause I observed a shift, the composure thinning, the hands growing still. Which is why what has been happening to me these past 11 days has been so profoundly distressing. Mr. Holmes, I am losing words, not in the way that one occasionally gropes for a name or a term. I am familiar with that common frailty, and this is not it. I mean that specific words have vanished from my mind entirely, cleanly, completely, as though they had been surgically removed while I slept. The winter sunlight fell between them, Holmes in his chair, Calloway in his. And I recall thinking that the light seemed almost to be listening too, holding itself still in that bright, attentive way it had possessed all morning. Holmes said nothing. He merely inclined his head, and Calloway, recognizing the invitation, continued. "Each morning upon waking, I discover that a particular word is simply gone. I reach for it and find nothing, no echo, no approximation, only a smooth and terrible absence, like a gap in a bookshelf where a beloved volume once stood. The word is not on the tip of my tongue. It is not hovering at the edge of recollection. It has been excised, and each morning it is a different word." He drew a slow breath. 11 mornings, 11 words. I have kept a careful record. The list in Copperplate. From the interior pocket of his overcoat, Professor Calloway produced a small notebook bound in dark green leather, its corners softened by years of handling. He opened it to a page near the back and extended it toward Holmes with the deliberate care of a man presenting evidence he knows to be extraordinary and fears may be dismissed as delusion. Holmes took the notebook and held it beneath the winter light that still poured generously through our window. I rose from my chair and moved to stand behind him, a liberty he permitted without comment, and together we regarded the page. The handwriting was exquisite. Each entry had been set down in a copperplate so precise and so beautiful that it seemed less like penmanship than like engraving, the work of a hand trained across decades to treat every written word as an act of respect. The entries were arranged in a simple columnar format, the date on the left, the lost word on the right. I read them in sequence, and as I did, I felt a strange, slow chill that had nothing to do with the January air. January 14th, Cathedral. January 15th, Sparrow. January 16th, Longitude. January 17th, Amber. January 18th, Patience. January 19th, Orchard. January 20th, River. January 21st, Telescope. January 22nd, Hymn. January 23rd, Evening. January 24th, Window. 11 words. Ordinary words, every one of them. The kind of words that furnish daily speech so naturally that their absence would leave not a dramatic void, but a subtle wrongness, like a room in which a single painting has been removed, and the eye keeps returning to the bare nail. You will observe, Calloway said quietly, that the words share no obvious category. They are not all nouns of a particular type, not all drawn from a single semantic field. I have tested every pattern I know, alphabetical, phonetic, thematic, etymological. I have cross-referenced them against frequency tables, against my own published works, against the indices of every significant text in my library. I can find no logic in the selection. Holmes said nothing for a long moment. His eyes moved across the list with the slow, methodical intensity I had witnessed 1,000 times, at crime scenes, over coded messages, across the faces of men who believed themselves innocent. When at last he spoke, his voice carried a note I recognized as genuine intellectual respect. You are quite certain, Professor, that these words are entirely absent, not merely difficult to retrieve, but wholly inaccessible? I am a linguist, Mr. Holmes. I know the difference between a word misplaced and a word removed. When I attempt to recall any one of these 11 terms, I encounter not difficulty, but nullity. It is as though the word never existed in any language I have known. Holmes closed the notebook but did not return it. He held it in his lap, and I noticed, though I do not believe Calloway did, that his right thumb moved slowly across the leather cover in a gesture that struck me as almost tender, the way one might touch the binding of a book that has become, through long association, something more than paper and thread. Professor Calloway, Holmes said, the pattern exists. I do not yet see it, but I perceive its outline the way one perceives the shape of a figure standing behind frosted glass. These words are connected, and their selection is not random. This is not a medical matter. He paused, and his gray eyes held Calloway's with a steadiness that was itself a kind of promise. Someone is choosing these words for you. The question is not whether there is a design, but what the design intends to communicate. The fire crackled softly in the grate. Calloway's hands, which had been so still during his account, trembled once and were steady again. After the client departs. Calloway departed with Holmes's assurance that we would visit him in Oxford within 2 days, and with the particular expression of a man who has carried a burden into a room and left a portion of it behind, not relieved of the weight entirely, but no longer bearing it alone. Mrs. Hudson showed him out, and I heard the front door close below with its familiar, solid sound, and then the street was quiet again, and it was just the two of us in the sitting room with the fire and the winter light and the green leather notebook that Holmes had not relinquished. I returned to my chair. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Holmes remained in his customary posture, legs crossed, chin lowered, the notebook resting upon his knee, but his attention was directed inward, toward whatever vast and intricate machinery operated behind those gray eyes. I have often thought that watching Holmes think is rather like watching a cathedral from the outside. One can admire the architecture, note the buttresses and the spires, even hear faintly the music within, but the true experience, the vaulted space, the colored light, the reverberating silence, belongs only to those inside. I considered, and then spoke. I did so not as his chronicler or his companion in adventure, but as his physician and his friend. Holmes, this morning, the street, he did not look up. A residual effect of the carbon disulfide I was employing last evening. The fumes, when inadequately ventilated, can produce transient disorientation. It is documented in Hoffman's third volume and is entirely without lasting consequence. His voice was crisp, definitive, and categorically intended to close the subject. Under ordinary circumstances, I would have allowed it to remain closed. But I had been watching him with the notebook, and what I had observed made silence feel less like discretion and more like negligence. For as he sat there in the strengthening morning light, Holmes's long fingers traced the list of vanished words with a slowness, a care, a gentleness so foreign to his usual brisk handling of evidence that it seemed almost involuntary, as though some part of him that lived below the level of deduction and analysis recognized in Calloway's loss something that touched the borders of his own private country. He did not speak of it. I did not press. Between men who have shared rooms and dangers and silences for the better part of 2 decades, there are conversations that take place entirely in what is not said, and this was one of them. I understood in that quiet moment that Holmes had taken this case not merely because the puzzle intrigued him, though it did, but because the morning had opened a door in him that he had not known existed, and Calloway's gentle, precise despair had walked through it before he could think to close it again. The fire burned low and was rebuilt. The winter light moved its slow meridian across the floor. Holmes remained with the notebook, and I with my newspaper, and Baker Street held us both in its familiar, steadfast architecture while the hours turned and the day carried us toward Oxford, toward answers, and toward a truth that would prove to be not a matter of crime at all, but something far more delicate, far more human, and far more difficult to set down in words, which was, perhaps, the very point. 2 days hence, we found ourselves on the morning train to Oxford, and I confess I watched Holmes carefully the entire journey. But his mind, that morning, was a cathedral of glass, catching every light. The Great Western Railway has always struck me as possessing a personality distinct from its rivals, something more measured in the rhythm of its engines, more considered in the sway of its carriages, as though the line itself understood that the journey from London to Oxford is not merely a transit between stations, but a passage between states of mind. The city loosens its grip by degrees. Paddington yields to the western suburbs, the suburbs to the tentative green of Middlesex, and then, somewhere beyond Slough, the countryside asserts itself with the quiet confidence of a truth that has been waiting patiently to be acknowledged. I sat by the window and watched England unfold in panels of frost and pale, persistent sun. The fields were iron-hard beneath a rime that glittered with an almost mineral brilliance, and the bare trees stood along the hedgerows like notations in some vast, illegible score. Here and there a farmhouse chimney released its thread of smoke into the still air, and I found myself tracing each plume upward until it dissolved into the general whiteness of the sky, thinking of nothing in particular, which is itself a luxury that railway travel uniquely affords. Holmes sat opposite me, the green leather notebook open upon his knee. He had been studying the list of lost words since we departed Paddington, and occasionally, so quietly that I might have missed it, had the carriage not been otherwise silent. He murmured one of them aloud. Cathedral. A pause. Sparrow. Another pause. Longer. Longitude. He spoke each word as though tasting it, weighing it upon the tongue, testing not its meaning but its music, its texture, its particular gravity in the mouth. I had seen him examine physical evidence with precisely this quality of attention: a scrap of fabric, a trace of ash, a boot print in soft earth. And I understood that for Holmes, Words were evidence of a kind, and their absence was a crime scene. I had brought a copy of The Lancet, intending to occupy myself with a monograph on recent advances in the treatment of tropical anemia, but I confess the journal lay unopened upon my lap. I found myself watching Holmes instead, with the same quiet vigilance I had maintained since that strange morning 2 days prior. He had shown no further sign of the disorientation that had so unsettled me. His faculties, by every measure I could apply, were operating at their customary and formidable capacity, and yet I could not entirely dismiss what I had witnessed. A physician learns that symptoms are not erased by their resolution. They are letters in a correspondence whose full meaning may not yet be apparent. "Watson," Holmes said, without looking up from the notebook, "you are staring. I am admiring the landscape. You are admiring it in my direction, which suggests either that Berkshire has rearranged its geography or that you are conducting a clinical observation you would prefer I did not notice." The faintest smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I am quite well. The carbon disulfide has entirely cleared my system. You may direct your medical attention toward the Lancet, which I observe you have not opened." I smiled in return and unfolded the journal, though I did not read it. Between us, the notebook lay open, its copperplate list catching the winter light that streamed through the carriage window. And for a time the only sounds were the rhythmic percussion of the wheels upon the rails and the occasional distant whistle as we passed through cuttings banked with frost. It was Holmes who broke the silence, and what he said surprised me. "Words," he remarked in the reflective tone he reserved for observations that lived at the boundary between deduction and philosophy, "are the furniture of the mind. We arrange them according to our habits and our needs, and over time we cease to notice them, as one ceases to notice a familiar chair or a clock upon a mantelpiece. But remove one, remove even a single apparently insignificant word, and the room in which we think becomes suddenly strange to us. We stumble where we once walked freely. We reach for what is no longer there." He closed the notebook. "To remove them systematically, Watson, is a kind of burglary more intimate than any I have investigated. It is theft conducted not upon a man's property, but upon his selfhood. I considered this. You are quite certain it is deliberate? That it is not simply disease?" He shook his head. "Neurological deterioration does not operate with this precision. It does not select words according to a hidden logic and remove them cleanly, leaving all surrounding function intact. No, Watson. This is the work of a human intelligence, a considerable one, and I confess it has my fullest attention." The train began to slow. Through the window, emerging from the morning mist like sentences written in stone against the sky, the spires of Oxford rose in their ancient and unhurried splendor, and I felt, as I always did upon approaching that city, a curious mingling of reverence and unease. The sense of entering a place where knowledge had been accumulating for so many centuries that it had become a kind of atmosphere, invisible and inescapable, pressing gently upon every surface. The house on Staverton Road. The cab from the station carried us northward through streets that possessed a character quite unlike London's restless energy. Oxford moved at the pace of thought rather than commerce. The pavements were quieter, the buildings lower and more dignified, and even the winter light seemed to behave differently here, falling with a scholarly patience upon the honeyed stone of college walls and the bare, reaching branches of trees that had been old when the Civil War was young. Staverton Road lay in that district of North Oxford where the university's influence gradually softens into domesticity, a street of handsome Victorian villas set back behind low walls and winter gardens, each house possessing the quiet self-assurance of a well-constructed argument. Professor Calloway's residence occupied the middle of a short terrace, distinguishable from its neighbors primarily by the depth of its front garden, where the skeletal forms of rose bushes and a single ancient pear tree suggested summers of considerable beauty and by the unusual number of books visible through the ground floor windows, stacked and shelved with such density that they appeared less like possessions than like structural elements, as though the house itself were built of literature. Calloway opened the door before we had reached the step, and his relief at our arrival was evident in the way his tall frame seemed to unbend slightly, shedding some fraction of the rigid composure that I suspected had become his default bearing since the trouble began. He ushered us into a hallway that confirmed what the exterior had promised. Bookshelves lined every available wall, climbing the staircase in orderly ranks like ivy ascending a trellis, their spines presenting a murmured catalogue of the world's languages: Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, Old Norse. I caught fragments of titles as we passed: grammars, lexicons, etymological dictionaries, phonetic atlases, the accumulated tools of a life devoted to understanding the very substance of human expression. "Mrs. Phelps," Calloway called with the slightly formal courtesy of a man accustomed to addressing even his household by surname, "our guests have arrived." The housekeeper who appeared from the kitchen passage was a compact, capable-looking Scotswoman of approximately 60, with steel-gray hair pinned beneath a plain cap and eyes that assessed Holmes with the particular blend of respect and suspicion that practical people often reserve for those whose reputations precede them. She acknowledged us with a nod that was civil without being warm, and withdrew to prepare tea with an efficiency that suggested strong opinions about visitors who arrived before 11. Holmes, meanwhile, had begun his examination of the house with that quality of observational absorption that transforms him, in such moments, from a social being into something closer to a scientific instrument. He moved through the hallway and into the study, a large, south-facing room dense with books, manuscripts, and the particular organized disorder of active scholarship, with his hands clasped behind his back and his gray eyes cataloging every surface, every object, every relationship between objects, with the silent, methodical intensity of a man reading a text written in a language only he could see. I watched him pause before a framed manuscript page mounted on the wall above the desk, medieval, beautifully illuminated, depicting a scene I could not immediately identify, and then move on to the desk itself, where a typewriting machine sat beside a stack of correspondence and a magnifying glass of the kind used for examining fine print. He touched nothing. He simply looked, and in his looking I could see the case assembling itself inside his mind the way a mosaic assembles, fragment by fragment, each piece meaningless alone, the pattern emerging only when sufficient pieces have found their proper positions. "Your study is most instructive, Professor," Holmes said at last. "I should now very much like to see the room in which you sleep." The bedroom and the bedside table. The staircase creaked beneath us in a manner that spoke of age and honest construction rather than neglect, and the books that lined its walls, I noticed now, shifted in character as we ascended, moving from the public scholarship of the ground floor toward something more personal. Poetry began to appear among the grammars. Novels shouldered aside the lexicons. By the first-floor landing, the shelves held volumes that bore the soft, rounded spines of books that have been read not once for information, but many times for comfort. And I recognized in their arrangement the private library of a man's inner life, as distinct from his professional one as a garden is from a field. Calloway's bedroom occupied the front of the house, overlooking Staverton Road through two tall windows now curtained against the January cold. It was a simple room, surprisingly so, given the scholarly abundance of the floors below. A single bed, neatly made, a wardrobe of dark oak, a washstand, a writing chair that had been placed beside the window, angled to catch the morning light, and a bedside table upon which rested a small and careful arrangement of objects that Holmes approached with the focused attention of an archaeologist uncovering a significant find: a glass of water, half consumed, a volume of Tennyson, the In Memoriam, I noted, not the Idylls, its pages marked with a slip of paper at a point roughly two-thirds through. A pair of reading spectacles with fine gold frames, folded and placed precisely parallel to the book's spine, and a small brass box, no larger than a man's palm, whose hinged lid bore the faintest patina of frequent handling. Holmes did not touch the box. He looked at Calloway, and the question in his expression was so gently framed that it barely qualified as inquiry. "My wife's wedding ring," Calloway said quietly. "Eleanor. She passed 3 years ago this April." "I am sorry," Holmes replied, and I noted, as I always noted because it was always rare, the particular quality of sincerity that entered his voice on the infrequent occasions when he expressed condolence. It was not the reflexive formula of social convention. It was something sparer and more honest, an acknowledgement of fact delivered with the same precision he brought to all statements he deemed important enough to make. "She was a linguist as well?" Holmes asked. "A finer one than I, in many respects. Her specialty was dying languages, languages spoken by only a handful of remaining native speakers, languages on the verge of silence. She spent her career documenting them, preserving them, trying to hold open doors that the world seemed intent on closing." Calloway's voice remained steady, but I observed that his right hand had moved, almost unconsciously, to rest upon the brass box. She understood loss in ways that most scholars only theorize about. She lived inside it. Holmes asked about the nightly routine, the precise sequence of actions Calloway performed before sleeping and upon waking. The professor described them with the methodical care of a man who has examined his own habits with forensic attention, hoping to find within them some explanation for what was happening to him. The water was poured fresh each evening. The Tennyson was read for precisely 20 minutes. The spectacles were removed and folded. The brass box was touched, not opened, simply touched, and then the lamp was extinguished. Each morning, upon waking, the first thing Calloway did was attempt to recall the previous day's conversation in its entirety, a mental exercise he had practiced for decades. And it was during this exercise, each morning for 11 mornings now, that he discovered the new absence. The latest word removed from his mind as cleanly as a book removed from a shelf, leaving only the gap and the bewildering certainty that something had once occupied it. Holmes listened to this account with his head slightly bowed and his eyes half closed, and when it was finished, he asked a question that seemed, on its surface, to depart from the matter at hand. "The young man who visits you each week, your former student. Tell me about him." Calloway's expression shifted in a way I found difficult to read. Not suspicion, not discomfort. Something more complex, the look of a man who holds two truths about a person simultaneously and is uncertain which to present. "Arthur Fenn," he said, "a gifted philologist. He lectures at one of the smaller colleges. He visits each Thursday evening, and we discuss his research over supper. He has been extraordinarily kind since Eleanor's death." Holmes nodded slowly, and I sensed that whatever he had read in Calloway's hesitation had added a new piece to the mosaic. The devoted student. The tea house to which Calloway directed us occupied a narrow premises on a cobbled lane within sight of the Bodleian, the sort of establishment that seems to exist in Oxford by natural right rather than commercial ambition. Low-ceilinged, warm, fragrant with Darjeeling and old wood, its tables scarred by generations of undergraduate elbows and scattered with the crumbs of 1,000 academic arguments. Holmes and I arrived first and secured a table near the back, beside a window that looked out upon a small churchyard where the gravestones stood in patient ranks beneath the winter sky. Arthur Fenn was punctual. He appeared at the appointed hour with the slightly breathless manner of a man who has walked quickly from a lecture hall and not yet fully shed the rhythms of public speech. He was younger than I had expected, 34, perhaps 35, with dark, serious eyes behind round spectacles, and the kind of thin, intelligent face that seems to have been designed specifically for the environment of libraries and tutorial rooms. His clothing was neat but unremarkable, his handshake firm but brief, and he carried beneath his left arm a leather portfolio bulging with papers that he set upon the table with the unconscious protectiveness of a parent settling a child. "Thank you for agreeing to meet, Mr. Fenn," Holmes began, and I noticed that he had adopted the tone he employed when interviewing witnesses he wished to set at ease, warmer than his investigative voice, more conversational, with the sharp edges of interrogation carefully filed away. "Professor Calloway speaks of you with considerable regard." Fenn's face colored faintly with pleasure. "The professor is very generous. I owe him more than I can properly express. He supervised my doctoral work, introduced me to the field, wrote the references that secured my current position. He has been—" The young man paused, searching for a word that might be adequate. "A second father in many respects, which is why his current difficulty distresses me so profoundly." "You have witnessed the word loss firsthand?" "Once, last Thursday. We were discussing a passage in his monograph on ablative constructions in late Latin, and he reached for the word bridge, a perfectly ordinary word, a word he must have used 10,000 times in his career, and it simply was not there. I watched him search for it. It was like watching a man reach into his pocket for a key he has carried every day of his life, and finding the pocket empty. He recovered his composure quickly, but I could see, anyone who knows him could see, the fear beneath." Holmes nodded and asked Fenn about his own research. The young man brightened, as scholars tend to when given permission to discuss their work, and explained that he was writing a monograph on the relationship between memory and syntax, specifically how the grammatical structures of a language shape the way its speakers encode and retrieve remembered experience. "It was," he said, "a continuation of work that Professor Calloway and his late wife had pioneered together. And in your professional opinion, Mr. Fenn, what do you believe is happening to Professor Calloway?" The brightness faded. Fenn removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a handkerchief, a gesture I recognized as displacement activity, the body's way of providing the hands with occupation while the mind confronts something it would rather not. "I believe," he said carefully, "that it is a cognitive matter. Early deterioration of the lexical retrieval pathways. It is not uncommon in individuals of the professor's age, particularly those who have subjected their minds to decades of intensive linguistic work. The architecture, if you will, begins to show strain." He replaced his spectacles. "I have urged him to consult a specialist at the Radcliffe. He has thus far declined." "You do not consider it possible," Holmes said, with the mildness of a man commenting upon the weather, "that the word loss might be the result of deliberate human action?" Fenn stared. The suggestion appeared to strike him as belonging to an entirely different order of reality from the one he inhabited. "Deliberate? You mean someone is doing this to him? Intentionally?" He shook his head with the instinctive rejection of a man for whom the academic world, however competitive, operates within boundaries that exclude personal malice. "In our world, Mr. Holmes, disagreements are conducted through footnotes and peer review, not through whatever this would be." "Quite," Holmes said. And then, as though the question had only just occurred to him and was of no particular importance, he added, "Tell me, does the professor ever speak of a colleague named Dr. Enid Blackwood?" A name that lingers. The change in Arthur Fenn was small but unmistakable. A tightening at the outer corners of the eyes, a fractional contraction of the fingers resting upon the table's edge. The kind of involuntary response that the body produces before the conscious mind has had time to compose a suitable expression, and that tells an observer like Holmes, or indeed like any reasonably attentive physician, far more than whatever words might follow. "Dr. Blackwood," Fenn repeated, and his voice, though still controlled, had lost its earlier ease. Yes, I know the name, of course. She was the professor's closest colleague for many years. They collaborated extensively, 20 years or more, I believe, in the field of applied mnemonics and associative linguistics. And the nature of their work together? Fenn hesitated. It was the hesitation of a man choosing between candor and loyalty, and I felt a certain sympathy for him. He was, I suspected, constitutionally inclined toward both, and finding them, in this moment, difficult to reconcile. They were developing theoretical frameworks for what they termed constructed memory techniques. The essential premise was that specific words or concepts could be either implanted in or removed from an individual's active vocabulary through carefully designed programs of associative conditioning. Environmental cues, repetitive contextual exposure, targeted sensory triggers. It was speculative work, largely theoretical, but it attracted considerable attention in linguistic circles and, I gather, some controversy. And the collaboration ended? Approximately 5 years ago. Badly, I understand, though the professor rarely speaks of it. The dispute concerned the publication of a joint research paper. Dr. Blackwood wished to publish their findings on the removal techniques. The professor believed the work was incomplete and potentially open to misapplication. They could not agree. The partnership dissolved. Fenn paused. Dr. Blackwood retired shortly afterward to a village outside Oxford. Woodstock, I believe. The professor has not spoken to her since, to my knowledge. Holmes thanked Fenn with a warmth that was, I recognized, both genuine and strategic. The gratitude of a man who has received precisely the information he sought, delivered in precisely the innocent manner that confirmed its reliability. We parted on the cobbled lane, Fenn heading back toward his college with his portfolio clutched beneath his arm and his thin shoulders braced against the cold, and Holmes and I turning in the opposite direction toward Staverton Road and the long walk that Holmes always preferred when he wished to think aloud. The afternoon was failing. The winter sun, which had accompanied us so faithfully from London, had begun its early retreat behind the western rooftops, and the light that remained was thin and provisional, lending the stone facades of the colleges a quality of transience they did not possess, as though even the most enduring structures might, in the right light, reveal themselves as temporary. The case, Holmes said, his breath forming small clouds in the sharpening cold, has become considerably more interesting. Blackwood's research, I said. The removal techniques. You believe she is applying them to Calloway? I believe that the list of lost words is not random, Watson. It is a message. And whoever composed it understands language not merely as a tool of communication, but as an architecture, a structure that can be entered, navigated, and selectively dismantled. He walked several paces in silence. Someone is taking apart Professor Calloway's house, one brick at a time, and they are choosing the bricks with extraordinary care. But to what end? That, Holmes replied, is what we shall discover in Woodstock. We walked the remainder of the way without speaking, and as we turned into Staverton Road, I noticed that the winter sun had completed its descent, and the spires that had seemed so solid that morning, those stone sentences I had admired from the train. The evening settled over Staverton Road with the unhurried deliberateness of a theater curtain descending between acts. Calloway's study, which had been so generously illuminated by winter sunlight that morning, now drew its warmth from a pair of gas lamps and the fire that Mrs. Phelps had built to a steady, companionable blaze before withdrawing for the night. The books that lined every wall seemed to press closer in the lamplight, their gilt-lettered spines glowing softly, and the room took on the quality of a place that exists slightly outside of ordinary time, a scholar's sanctum, insulated by language from the crude mechanics of the world beyond its windows. Holmes had asked for the use of Calloway's desk, and the professor had obliged with the quiet courtesy of a man too grateful for assistance to question the methods of his assistant. For the better part of an hour, Holmes worked in near total silence, The green leather notebook opened before him alongside several of Calloway's own reference texts. An etymological dictionary of considerable antiquity, a compendium of Indo-European root forms, and a slim volume on the phonological evolution of Old English. He made occasional notes on a sheet of foolscap in his own angular hand, but mostly he simply stared at the list, his gray eyes moving from word to word with the slow, calibrated intensity of a man reading not the surface of a text, but its architecture, its hidden scaffolding, the intentions concealed beneath its visible form. Calloway and I sat by the fire and did not speak. I had offered conversation, but the professor had declined with a gentle shake of his head, and I understood that he preferred silence, that in this room, surrounded by the words that had been his life's work, silence felt less like absence and more like respect. I occupied myself instead with observation. The fire, the books, the particular quality of Holmes's concentration, which had changed over the years from the frenetic, almost febrile intensity of his youth into something denser and more patient, like a jeweler examining facets under strong light, turning the stones slowly, trusting that the flaw or the brilliance would reveal itself to sustained attention rather than to force. When Holmes finally spoke, his voice was quiet and carried the particular weight it assumed when he had arrived at a conclusion that mattered. Professor Calloway, the words you have lost, cathedral, sparrow, longitude, amber, patience, orchard, river, telescope, hymn, evening, window. Their initial letters spell nothing of consequence. That was the first thing I checked, and it is the obvious trap, the pattern that a clever designer places on the surface to distract from the pattern beneath. He rose from the desk and crossed to where we sat, the sheet of foolscap in his hand. But the etymological roots of these words, traced back through Old English, Latin, and Greek to their deepest recoverable origins, tell a different story. Each root word, taken in sequence, contributes a syllable or a phoneme to a phrase that would be immediately recognizable to any scholar of historical linguistics. He placed the foolscap on the table between us. Upon it, in Holmes's precise hand, was written, "You promised you would remember." The room went very still. Not the stillness of shock, but of recognition, the deep tectonic shift that occurs when something long buried is brought to the surface and the ground rearranges itself around the new reality. The fire crackled once and subsided. The gas lamps held their steady flame, and Calloway sat motionless in his chair, his face undergoing a transformation so private and so profound that I felt almost indecent for witnessing it. It was not surprise. It was the look of a man who opens a door he locked long ago and finds, standing on the other side, exactly the person he most feared and most longed to see. "Eleanor," he said softly, and in that single word, his wife's name, spoken to the quiet room and the listening books and the two men who sat with him in the lamplight, I heard the entire history of a love and a loss and a promise that had been buried beneath 3 years of grief. What Eleanor knew. The fire required attention, and I was grateful for the excuse to rise and tend it, because the moment that followed Calloway's utterance of his wife's name was one of such naked intimacy that even Holmes, who has never been accused of an excess of social delicacy, averted his gaze and allowed the silence to hold without interruption. I placed 2 fresh coals upon the grate and adjusted the screen, performing these small domestic actions with the exaggerated care of a man who understands that sometimes the most useful thing one can do in the presence of another's grief is to attend to the fire and say nothing. When Calloway spoke again, his voice had steadied, though it carried an undertone of weariness that suggested the composure was costing him something considerable. "I owe you an explanation, Mr. Holmes, and you, Dr. Watson. What I am about to tell you, I have not spoken of to anyone, not to Arthur Fenn, not to Mrs. Phelps, not to any of my remaining colleagues. I have carried it alone, which is perhaps the source of the trouble." He drew a slow breath and arranged his hands upon his knees with the precision of a man about to deliver a lecture on a subject he knows by heart, but has never before spoken aloud. Eleanor was diagnosed in the spring of 1893 with a progressive aphasia, a gradual, irreversible deterioration of the brain's capacity to produce and comprehend language. For a woman who had devoted her life to the study of dying languages, the cruelty of the diagnosis was almost literary in its precision. She was to experience within her own mind the very process she had spent her career documenting in the languages of others. Word by word, phrase by phrase, the architecture of her speech would be dismantled, until what remained was silence. He paused. The fire I had just rebuilt offered its first tentative flame, and the light caught the moisture in Calloway's eyes, without his seeming to notice. She bore it with a courage that I cannot adequately describe and do not expect you to fully comprehend, because courage of that order must be witnessed to be believed. She documented everything, every lost word, every failed construction, every morning's new absence. She kept notebooks, dozens of them, recording the progression with the same meticulous care she had brought to her fieldwork among the speakers of vanishing tongues. She said it was the last piece of research she would ever conduct, and she intended it to be useful. Useful, Holmes repeated quietly. She wanted me to write about it. Not a clinical report. There were physicians enough for that, but a human account. A book that would describe, from the inside, what it means to lose language. She believed that others facing the same condition, and those who loved them, deserved to know that they were not alone in the experience. She asked me to promise that I would write it, that I would use her notes, my expertise, and our shared understanding of what language means to a life, to create something that might comfort where medicine could not. And you promised. I promised. The word fell into the room like a stone into deep water, and I watched its ripples move across Calloway's features. I held her hand in the garden of the house where we had lived for 30 years, and I promised that I would write the book. And she believed me, because in 41 years of marriage, I had never broken a promise to her. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of the weight of the confession that had not yet come but that all three of us could feel approaching, the way one feels a change in barometric pressure before the weather turns. She died in April of 1895. And the grief, Mr. Holmes? The grief was a kind of aphasia of its own. It took from me not words but the will to use them. I could not write. I could not think about the book without hearing her voice asking me to promise, and I could not hear her voice without feeling that I was being buried alive. So I placed her notebooks in a trunk. I carried the trunk to the attic, and I closed the door. He looked at Holmes with an expression of such unguarded honesty that I felt the room itself draw a breath. I broke my promise, and I have lived with that knowledge for 3 years, and it has been the worst thing, worse than the grief, worse than the loneliness. The knowledge that the one thing she asked of me, the last thing, I could not do. Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then, with a gentleness I had witnessed perhaps half a dozen times in all our years together, he asked the question whose answer I suspect he already knew. Professor Calloway, did Dr. Enid Blackwood know about the promise? Yes, Calloway said. Eleanor told her. They were the dearest of friends. The visit to Woodstock. The morning broke cold and clear over Oxfordshire, and the short drive from the city to the village of Woodstock carried us through a landscape that seemed to have been composed rather than merely formed. Rolling fields of silver frost, copses of bare oak whose branches described intricate patterns against a sky of the palest possible blue, and here and there the spire of a parish church rising above a cluster of stone cottages with the unassuming authority of a truth that has no need to raise its voice. Woodstock itself was a village of considerable antiquity and quiet self-possession, arranged along a broad street that led eventually to the gates of Blenheim Palace, though we did not travel so far. Holmes had obtained Dr. Blackwood's address from the university registry, a stone cottage at the eastern edge of the village, set behind a low wall over which the bare canes of climbing roses arched in dormant expectation of spring. Watson noticed as we approached that the garden, though surrendered to winter's necessary austerity, bore the unmistakable signs of devoted and knowledgeable cultivation. The beds were mulched and protected. The paths were swept. A bird table, recently provisioned, stood near the gate, and as we passed it, a robin regarded us from its rim with the calm, territorial interest of a creature that considers itself the garden's true proprietor. Holmes knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as though our arrival had been anticipated, which, as became apparent within moments, it had. Dr. Enid Blackwood was 68 years old, white-haired, and possessed of a gaze so direct and so unhurried that it reminded me, with a small shock of recognition, of Holmes himself. She was small in stature, but carried herself with the compressed energy of a much larger person, and her face, lined, weathered, handsome rather than beautiful, bore the particular expression of a woman who has made a difficult decision, lived with its consequences, and does not intend to apologize for it. "Mr. Holmes," she said. "Dr. Watson, do come in. The kettle has just boiled." Her cottage was modest in scale but immaculate in its order, and the books that lined its walls, fewer than Calloway's but chosen with evident discrimination, spoke of a mind that valued depth over breadth. A fire burned in a small stone hearth. On the mantelpiece, in a simple silver frame, stood a single photograph that arrested my attention the moment I entered the room. 3 figures on a summer lawn, laughing. A younger Calloway, tall and unbent. A woman I took to be Eleanor, dark-haired, bright-eyed, her head thrown back in unguarded delight. And Blackwood herself, one hand resting on Eleanor's arm with the easy intimacy of long and deep affection. We sat. Tea was poured. Holmes did not engage in preliminary conversation. He did not accuse. He did not employ the oblique approach he sometimes favored with suspects who required careful handling. He simply told Blackwood, in measured and respectful terms, what he had discovered. The pattern in the words, the etymological message and its meaning, and then he asked her to explain. Blackwood set down her teacup. She met Holmes's gaze without flinching, without defiance, without apology. And she said, in a voice as clear and steady as the winter morning beyond her window, "I was wondering when someone would come." The confession that was not a crime. "I will not insult your intelligence by pretending surprise, Mr. Holmes, and I will not waste your time with denials. I did what Edwin's list tells you I did, and I did it for reasons I believe you are already beginning to understand." Blackwood spoke with the clarity of a woman who had rehearsed this conversation many times in the theater of her own mind, not because she feared it, but because she respected language too much to waste it on imprecision, even in confession. The techniques Edwin and I developed together over 20 years of collaboration are real. They are subtle, limited in scope, and, I must emphasize this, entirely reversible. The principle is one of associative interference. By introducing carefully calibrated environmental stimuli into a subject's daily routine, one can temporarily suppress the neural pathways that connect a specific word to its meaning and its phonological form. The word is not destroyed. It is, in essence, placed behind a curtain. Remove the stimuli and the curtain lifts. Full retrieval returns within days. "And the stimuli?" Holmes asked. "How were they introduced?" Each Wednesday, when Edwin leaves the house for his weekly visit to the Bodleian, and Mrs. Phelps goes to the market, I enter through the garden door. Edwin has never changed the lock, and I have retained my key from the years when Eleanor and I were as much a part of that house as the furniture. I make small, precise alterations to his environment, the arrangement of objects on his bedside table, the placement of a particular book, a trace of scent, lavender, cedar, camphor, applied to his pillow or his reading chair. Each alteration is designed to activate a specific associative chain that, during sleep, suppresses the target word. It requires an intimate knowledge of the subject's personal history, his sensory associations, his emotional architecture. She paused. I have known Edwin Calloway for 35 years. I possess that knowledge. Holmes regarded her steadily. And the selection of the words themselves, the message encoded in their etymological roots, this was deliberate from the outset? Of course. I chose each word not only for its susceptibility to associative suppression, but for its root etymology. The message was the point. Everything else was mechanism. Her voice did not waver, but something in her eyes, a brightness that might have been defiance and might have been grief, deepened as she continued. Eleanor was my closest friend for 3 decades, Mr. Holmes. I was with her when the aphasia was diagnosed. I was with her through the years of its progression. I sat beside her bed in the final weeks, when the woman who had devoted her life to language could no longer form a sentence, and I held her hand, and I listened to the silence that had swallowed her whole. She drew a breath. And I was there when she asked Edwin to promise. I watched him take her hand and give his word. And I have watched for 3 years as he buried that promise alongside her, unable to face it, unable to break free of a grief that has become its own kind of aphasia, a loss of will rather than a loss of words. So you took his words, Holmes said quietly, to remind him of hers. I took his words to deliver a message I could not deliver in person, because Edwin has refused to speak to me since our professional disagreement. I constructed a puzzle I knew he could solve. Or, failing that, one that would lead him to seek the help of someone who could. Either way, the message would reach him. She folded her hands in her lap. I am not sorry for what I have done, Mr. Holmes. I am sorry only that it was necessary. The room was very quiet. The fire whispered in the grate. Outside, the robin had returned to the bird table and was singing, a small, bright, defiant sound in the cold air. And I found myself thinking that the song and the woman shared a quality. Both were fragile in appearance and remarkably, stubbornly strong. Holmes at the window. Holmes rose from his chair and crossed to the window. It was a gesture I had witnessed 1,000 times in 1,000 different rooms, the physical expression of a mind that required space in which to arrange its conclusions. But on this occasion, it carried a weight I had not often seen. He stood with his back to us, his hands clasped in their customary position behind him, and looked out at the winter garden where the bare earth waited beneath its careful mulch, and the climbing roses held their thorned architecture against the cold stone wall. I watched him in profile when he turned slightly to follow the flight of the robin from the bird table to the pear tree at the garden's edge. The light from the window, that same clear, sharp winter light that had begun this entire affair in our sitting room at Baker Street, fell across his features with an almost sculptural precision, illuminating the high forehead, the aquiline nose, the firm set of the mouth. But it also illuminated something less easily defined, a quality of interior negotiation, as though Holmes were conducting a private tribunal in which evidence and ethics were being weighed on a scale more delicate than any I could see. I understood in that moment what this case had cost him, not in effort, for the deductive challenge had been, by his standards, moderate, but in the currency of self-confrontation. The morning on which Professor Calloway first entered our rooms was also the morning on which Holmes had stood in his own doorway and failed for one terrible instant to recall the name of the street where he had lived for 17 years. He had dismissed it. He had attributed it to chemical fumes. But he had taken this case with an urgency that his dismissal could not explain. and he had handled Calloway's notebook with a tenderness that was wholly unlike his usual brisk treatment of evidence. And now he stood at a window in Woodstock and looked out at a winter garden, and I knew, with the certainty of a man who has spent 20 years learning to read the silences of his closest friend, that he was thinking not only about Calloway's lost words, but about his own. He turned back at last and addressed Blackwood with a directness that was, in its own way, a form of respect. The technique reverses itself entirely? You are certain? There is no possibility of residual damage? None, Blackwood replied without hesitation. The suppression is temporary by design. Within 3 to 5 days of ceasing the environmental triggers, full lexical retrieval returns. I would not have proceeded otherwise. I would never harm Edwin. He is... She stopped. He was Eleanor's husband. He is the keeper of her memory. I would no more damage his mind than I would burn her notebooks. Holmes nodded. The nod carried the weight of a verdict. I will speak with Professor Calloway, he said. I will tell him what you have done and why. What he chooses to do with that knowledge is his affair, and I will offer him no recommendation beyond the facts. But I would ask you, Dr. Blackwood, to cease the program immediately. Whatever message remains undelivered, I believe it has now been delivered by other means. It was nearly complete in any case, she said. There were only 3 words remaining. Holmes paused at the door. And the final word? The one that would have concluded the sequence? Blackwood looked at him, and for the first time her composure showed a fracture. The slightest trembling at the edge of her expression, the brightness in her eyes resolving unmistakably into tears she did not permit to fall. Promise, she said. The last word was going to be promise. Holmes held her gaze for a moment that felt, in its density and its silence, like an entire conversation conducted without language. Then he inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement that encompassed, I believed, not only the ingenuity of her method, but the fierce and unyielding love that had driven it. And we stepped out into the cold, bright air of the Woodstock morning. We drove back toward Oxford in the hired trap, and Holmes spoke very little on the short journey. But his silence had the quality not of withdrawal, but of preparation. The silence of a man composing, in the private chambers of his mind, the precise words he would need for the conversation that awaited us at Staverton Road. Chapter 4. The Promise Remembered. The early afternoon light was already beginning to thin by the time we arrived back at Calloway's house, the winter sun retreating westward with the weary haste of a traveler who knows the distance still to cover before dark. Staverton Road lay quiet beneath a sky that had faded from the morning's crystalline blue to a softer, more tentative gray, and the houses along the terrace had begun to light their lamps, each window offering its small, warm protest against the gathering dusk. Mrs. Phelps admitted us with an expression that confirmed what I had long suspected about the perceptive capacities of experienced housekeepers. She knew, with a certainty that required no evidence and no explanation, that the 2 men crossing her threshold carried news of consequence. She took our coats and hats with her usual brisk efficiency, but I noticed that she paused for a fraction of a moment before withdrawing, her eyes moving from Holmes to me and back again, with a look that was less curiosity than preparation, the look of a woman readying herself to manage whatever aftermath might follow. She served tea without being asked, and withdrew to the kitchen, closing the door behind her with a quietness that was itself a form of tact. Calloway was in his study, seated at his desk amid his dictionaries and his grammars, and the image he presented as we entered, an elderly man surrounded by the accumulated language of a lifetime, bathed in the amber glow of a single desk lamp, struck me with a force that was almost physical. Here was a man whose walls contained more words than most people would speak in several lifetimes, and yet it was the absence of a handful of them that had brought him to the attention of Sherlock Holmes. The disproportion between the vastness of what he possessed and the smallness of what he had lost was, I reflected, precisely the source of the case's peculiar poignancy. It is not the large losses that undo us. It is the small ones. The single missing book, the empty chair, the name we reach for in the dark and cannot find. Holmes seated himself opposite Calloway, and I took the chair beside the fire, understanding without being told that my role in this conversation was to be present without being prominent, to serve as witness, as ballast, as the grounding presence that would keep the room steady while difficult truths were spoken. Holmes regarded the professor for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quality I can only describe as deliberate gentleness. Not the softness of condescension, but the measured care of a man who understands that the words he is about to deliver will rearrange the furniture of another man's inner life, and who wishes to place each one with precision. He told Calloway everything: Blackwood's method, her weekly visits to the empty house, the environmental triggers carefully placed and calibrated, the associative suppression technique they had developed together decades ago, now turned to a purpose neither of them had originally envisioned. And the message, that quiet, devastating phrase encoded in the etymological roots of 11 ordinary words, reaching across years of silence and estrangement to deliver the only thing Enid Blackwood believed still mattered. You promised you would remember. Holmes delivered it all without editorializing, without judgment, without recommendation. He presented the facts as he always did, clearly, completely, respectfully. And then he fell silent, and the study was quiet, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant domestic sounds of Mrs. Phelps moving about the kitchen. And we waited for Calloway to speak. He did not speak for a very long time. The trunk in the attic. When Calloway finally rose from his chair, he did so with the slow deliberateness of a man who has made a decision that has been waiting to be made for longer than he cares to acknowledge. He did not speak. He simply stood, looked at Holmes, looked at me, and then moved toward the study door with a gravity that invited us to follow without requiring him to ask. We ascended the staircase in single file, Calloway first, then Holmes, then myself, past the bookshelves that climbed the walls in their orderly ranks, past the first-floor landing with its poetry and its novels, and up a narrower flight of steps to a door at the top of the house. Calloway produced a key from his waistcoat pocket, a small, plain key, unremarkable in every respect, except for the fact that his hand trembled as he fitted it to the lock. And I understood that whatever lay behind this door had not been visited in a very long time, and that the act of opening it was costing him something that could not be measured in any currency I knew. The attic was cold. The warmth of the lower floors, so carefully maintained by Mrs. Phelps and her diligent fires, did not reach this high, and the air had the still preserved quality of a room that has been sealed against time. Not musty exactly, but suspended, as though the atmosphere itself had been holding its breath. A single dormer window admitted the last of the afternoon light, frosted at its edges and casting a pale, diffuse illumination across the bare floorboards and the sparse contents of the space. A few boxes of books, a standing mirror draped in cloth, and there, beneath the window, a leather trunk. It was not large, perhaps 3 feet in length, 2 in width, and its leather surface bore the scuffs and softening of long use. Calloway knelt before it with the careful movements of a man mindful of aging joints and opened the brass clasps. The lid rose on silent hinges, and I saw, arranged within, a collection of notebooks bound in different colors, blue, green, cream, gray, each one labeled on its cover in a hand that was not Calloway's, a woman's hand, Eleanor's hand. Holmes and I stood back. This was not our moment, and we both knew it. Calloway lifted the first notebook, the blue one, and opened it, and I watched his face as he read, and what I saw there was not the fresh wound of new grief, but something older and more complex, the reopening of a loss that had scarred over but never healed, accompanied by a relief so profound that it was almost indistinguishable from pain. Eleanor's handwriting began steady and assured, the letters well-formed, the observations precise and clinical. She documented each lost word with the same meticulous care her husband would later bring to his own list. The date, the word, the context in which its absence was first noticed, and, beside each entry, a brief reflection on what the loss felt like from the inside. These reflections were written in language of remarkable clarity and beauty, and as Calloway turned the pages, I could see the handwriting begin to change. The letters grew less certain. Spaces appeared where words should have been, replaced by small pencil drawings, a bird in place of a word she could no longer write, a simple sun where an adjective had once lived, a question mark where meaning itself had faltered. The progression was gradual, meticulous, and almost unbearably moving, a record of a brilliant mind documenting its own dissolution with the courage and precision of a scientist who refuses to look away from the data, even when the data is her own disappearance. Calloway closed the notebook gently. He held it against his chest for a moment, and then he replaced it in the trunk and closed the lid and said, in a voice that was quiet but entirely steady, "Perhaps Enid was right. Perhaps it is time." Holmes speaks of forgetting. We returned to the study. The fire had burned lower in our absence, and I attended to it while Calloway settled back into his chair, and Holmes took the seat opposite, and for a time the only sounds were the familiar, comforting percussion of coal being arranged upon the grate and the soft collapse of ash beneath the poker's weight. These small domestic rituals have always seemed to me to possess a restorative power disproportionate to their simplicity. There is something in the tending of a fire that speaks to the oldest and most reassuring parts of the human mind, and I performed the task with a deliberateness that was, I confess, as much for my own benefit as for the room's warmth. When the fire was established, I returned to my chair, and it was then that Holmes did something I had witnessed perhaps half a dozen times in the entirety of our long association. Something so rare and so quietly extraordinary that I recorded it afterward in my private journal, with the detailed care I usually reserved for the most remarkable features of his cases. He spoke about himself, not directly, not with the confessional openness that Calloway had displayed, for that was not and would never be Holmes's way. But he addressed the professor with a candor that I recognized, even as I heard it, as a gift, a deliberate offering of vulnerability from a man who had built his life upon the principle that emotion was the enemy of reason, and who was choosing in this moment to set that principle temporarily aside. "Professor Calloway," he began, and his voice was measured in a way that told me each word had been selected with the same care Blackwood had used in selecting her target vocabulary, precisely, deliberately, with full awareness of its weight. "I will not pretend to understand the specific nature of your grief, for I have not loved as you have loved, and I have not lost as you have lost. But I understand, perhaps better than I would wish, the relationship between a mind and its owner, the dependency, the trust, the private terror that attends the first indication that the instrument upon which one has built everything may not be entirely within one's control." He did not look at me. I did not look at him. But the awareness between us was absolute. We were both thinking of the same morning, the same doorway, the same moment of blankness that had crossed his aquiline features like a cloud across the face of the sun. "Dr. Blackwood's actions were ethically questionable," Holmes continued. "She entered your home without permission. She manipulated your cognitive environment without consent. By any conventional standard, she transgressed boundaries that ought to be inviolable." He paused. "And yet I find that I cannot condemn her, because what she did in the service of a promise that was not hers to keep, but that she could not bear to see broken. She did it because Eleanor was her friend, because you were her colleague, and because the book your wife asked you to write is not merely a personal obligation, but a contribution to the understanding of human suffering that, in Blackwood's judgment and in mine, the world has need of." Calloway listened without interrupting, his hands resting upon the arms of his chair, his face holding the expression of a man receiving a diagnosis that is serious but not without hope. "The tools we rely upon most," Holmes said quietly, "are the ones whose loss we most dread. A violinist fears for his hands, a painter guards his eyes, and a man whose life has been built upon the architecture of language fears, above all else, the crumbling of that architecture." Your wife faced that fear with extraordinary courage. She documented it so that others might face it less alone. And she asked you, the person she trusted most in all the world, to ensure that her documentation would reach those who needed it. He leaned forward slightly. "Professor, I have spent my career in the service of truth, and I have found that truth, once uncovered, generally insists upon being acted upon. You know now why your words were taken. You know what message they carried, and you know, I think, what remains to be done." Calloway was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was rough but clear. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. Not for solving the case, for understanding it." The letter to Blackwood. The desk lamp cast its warm circle of light across the leather surface as Calloway drew a sheet of writing paper from the drawer and uncapped his pen. Holmes and I remained by the fire, not by explicit arrangement, but by the mutual understanding that what was about to take place was a private act, as private as prayer, as personal as memory, and that our role was simply to be present in the room while it happened, offering the silent companionship of witnesses who have no wish to intrude, but whose presence, by some alchemy of human nature, makes difficult things marginally easier to do. Calloway wrote slowly. The scratch of the nib upon the paper was the only sound in the study, and I found myself listening to it with a concentration that surprised me, attending to its rhythm, its pauses, its resumptions, as though the sound itself were a kind of music whose meaning I could intuit without reading a single word. He paused frequently. Not, I thought, because he could not find the words. The lost vocabulary, Holmes had assured us, would return within days, but because he was choosing them with a care that honored both the recipient and the subject. Each word was being weighed, considered, placed with the deliberation of a mason setting stones in an arch, each one essential to the structure's integrity. He did not show us the letter when it was finished, but he told us its substance, and I record it here as faithfully as memory allows. He told Enid Blackwood that he forgave her, not easily and not without reservation. He was honest about the violation he felt, the unsettling knowledge that his home and his mind had been entered without his consent, but ultimately, and with a fullness that I believed was genuine. He told her that he understood why she had done it, and that her understanding of him, of his grief, his paralysis, his inability to face the promise he had broken, was itself a kind of gift, however unwelcome its delivery had been, and he asked her for help. He asked whether she would be willing, as Eleanor's friend, as his former colleague, as someone who understood both the science of language and the sorrow of its loss, to work with him on the book that Eleanor had asked him to write. Not as a collaborator in the old, formal sense that had ended so badly between them, but as a companion in the task. Someone who had known Eleanor, someone who had loved her too, someone who could sit beside him while he opened the trunk in the attic and began, at last, to read. He folded the letter with the precise, unhurried movements of a man performing a ritual he intends to remember. He placed it in an envelope. He wrote the address in his copperplate hand, the cottage in Woodstock, the garden with its dormant roses, the robin on the bird table. He sealed it and set it upon the desk beside the lamp, and the small white rectangle seemed to glow in the warm light with a significance that exceeded its physical dimensions, the way certain ordinary objects, a ring, a photograph, a notebook of lost words, can become vessels for meaning so large that the object itself seems barely able to contain it. Holmes rose. The gesture was his way of signaling that our work was complete. not with announcement or ceremony, but with the simple, graceful economy of movement that characterized everything he did when he was satisfied. He extended his hand to Calloway, and the professor took it, and the handshake that passed between them was longer than convention required and said more than either man would have been willing to put into words. At the door, Calloway looked at us both, Holmes with his sharp gray eyes and his angular composure, me with my notebook and my medical bag, and my enduring capacity for being moved by things that Holmes would have called sentimental. And his expression was one I shall carry with me for the remainder of my days. It was not happiness. It was something prior to happiness, and perhaps more valuable, the look of a man who has set down a weight he has been carrying for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright without it. The evening train home. The evening train from Oxford to Paddington departed at 6:30, and we secured a compartment to ourselves, a small mercy for which I was grateful, as the events of the day had left me with the particular weariness that comes not from physical exertion, but from sustained emotional attentiveness, the fatigue of a heart that has been working as hard as the mind. Holmes, by contrast, appeared energized, not in the frenetic, restless manner of his younger years, but with a quieter vitality, the deep satisfaction of a man whose considerable powers have been employed in a cause he considers worthy. The countryside beyond the window had surrendered entirely to darkness. The frost-bright fields and skeletal hedgerows that had accompanied our morning journey were invisible now, replaced by the occasional lamp of a farmhouse glowing in the black distance like a star brought to earth, or the ghostly silhouette of bare trees caught momentarily in the carriage window's reflected light before vanishing back into the night. The train moved through this darkness with a steady, rhythmic confidence that I found deeply soothing, the mechanical heartbeat of iron and steam, reliable and unhurried, carrying us home. Holmes sat opposite me, his long legs crossed, his overcoat folded beside him. He had been gazing at the dark window, or perhaps at his own reflection in it, that pale, sharp-featured ghost that traveled alongside us, and after some time he reached into his coat pocket and produced the green leather notebook. Calloway had not asked for its return, and Holmes had not offered it, and I suspected that both men understood the notebook would find its way back when the time was right. He opened it to the page of lost words and read them once more. I could see his lips moving faintly as he traced the list. And then he closed it and returned it to his pocket with a finality that suggested the case, as a case, was concluded in his mind. "I shall post this back to the professor tomorrow," he said. "He will want all his words returned." I smiled. It was a small remark, but it carried within it the entire architecture of the case. The theft and the restoration, the loss and the recovery, the message sent and the message received. Holmes returned my smile with a faint one of his own, and for a moment the compartment felt very small and very warm and very safe, a moving room of lamplight hurtling through the English dark. We spoke briefly about dinner. Mrs. Hudson had mentioned something about a cold game pie before our departure, and then we lapsed into a silence that required no apology and no explanation. It was the silence of two men who have shared an experience that has deepened their understanding of each other without either of them needing to say so, and it accompanied us through the darkness of Berkshire and the gradual reappearance of the city's lights. First scattered, then clustering, then massing into the blazing constellation of London itself, spreading across the horizon like a story reaching its final chapter. The train slowed. The platform at Paddington materialized from the steam and the noise with the reassuring solidity of a familiar destination, and as we gathered our things and stepped down from the carriage into the cold, busy, magnificent chaos of the terminus, I reflected that some cases solve crimes, and that others, the rarer ones, the finer ones, solve something in the people who bring them, and that these latter cases, though they generate no headlines and fill no columns in the sensational press, are perhaps the ones that matter most because they remind us that the detective's art, at its highest expression, is not merely the science of deduction but the practice of attention, attention to the human heart with all its intricate, fragile, astonishing architecture. We found a cab. Holmes gave the address without hesitation. Baker Street, home. Chapter 5, The Words That Remain. The sitting room at 2021B received us with the uncomplicated generosity of a place that has been loved into permanence. Mrs. Hudson, whose instincts regarding our movements had long since transcended the merely domestic and entered the realm of the preternatural, had prepared for our return with a thoroughness that spoke of genuine affection disguised, as was her way, as professional duty. The fire was built and burning with the steady, unhurried confidence of a blaze that has been established for at least an hour. A cold supper was laid upon the sideboard. The promised game pie, a wheel of Stilton, bread, pickles, and a decanter of claret that caught the firelight and held it in its depths like a captured sunset. The gas lamps were lit to a low, warm degree that softened the room's familiar clutter into something approaching beauty. I stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, and I was struck, as one is sometimes struck by the ordinary, when the extraordinary has temporarily recalibrated one's capacity for attention, by the profound and particular comfort of this room. The books piled on every surface, the Persian slipper on the mantelpiece where Holmes kept his tobacco, the jackknife pinning correspondence to the wood above the fireplace, the bullet holes in the wall, arranged in a patriotic VR that Mrs. Hudson had long since abandoned any hope of repairing, the violin on its stand in the corner, waiting with the patient expectancy of an instrument that knows it will be played. And beyond the window, the lamplighter making his rounds along Baker Street, his long pole touching each gas lamp into life with a precision and a rhythm that transformed the ordinary act of illumination into something approaching ritual. We ate without ceremony and with considerable appetite. The pie was excellent. The Stilton was at that precise point of maturity where it yields to the knife with a kind of dignified reluctance. Holmes poured the claret and raised his glass fractionally in my direction. Not a toast exactly, but an acknowledgement, and I returned the gesture, and we drank, and the wine was good, and the fire was warm, and Baker Street held us in its steady, long-practiced embrace, while the January night pressed its cold face against the window panes, and was kept, as it had always been kept, at bay. A reflection on words and walls. I cleared the supper things and settled into my armchair with a measure of brandy, and Holmes took his customary position in the chair opposite, his pipe charged and lit, the fragrant smoke rising in slow, contemplative spirals toward the ceiling. The fire had reached that stage of its life where it requires no further attention, a bed of glowing coals that radiate a deep, even heat and occasionally shift with a soft sound that is less a crackle than a whisper, the sound of warmth talking quietly to itself. Holmes smoked in silence for some minutes, and when he spoke, his voice had the reflective quality it assumed when he was not so much conversing as thinking aloud, using speech as a tool for the final arrangement of thoughts that had already achieved their essential shape. "The technique," he said, "is theoretically fascinating. Blackwood's ability to target specific lexical items through environmental conditioning represents a genuine, if troubling, advancement in the understanding of human memory. But its practical applications are narrow. The method requires an intimate knowledge of the subject's personal associations, their history, their sensory landscape, their emotional architecture. It cannot be applied to strangers. It cannot be scaled. And it is, as Blackwood assured us, entirely reversible. The words will return to Calloway within the week." He drew upon his pipe and exhaled slowly. But the words were never truly the point. The message they carried was the point. Blackwood constructed an act of communication so elaborate, so deeply encoded, that it could only be read by someone who understood language at its most fundamental level, either Calloway himself or someone he trusted enough to consult. She built a puzzle that was also a letter. She engineered a crisis that was also an act of love. He paused. It is, I confess, among the most elegant pieces of applied linguistics I have ever encountered. And I say this as a man who has decoded messages hidden in dancing men, in the arrangement of orange pips, and in the navigational deviations of a steam launch on the Thames. I smiled at this. You admire her. I admire the craftsmanship, Holmes corrected, though the distinction, I suspected, was thinner than he wished to acknowledge. She used the tools of her discipline not to harm, but to heal, or rather, to create the conditions under which healing might become possible. It is a subtle but important distinction. She did not restore Calloway's will to write his wife's book. She merely removed the walls he had built around the obligation, so that the obligation could reach him again. He tapped his pipe against the arm of his chair. It is rather like writing a letter in invisible ink. The information was always there. It simply needed the right warmth to become visible. I considered this. The image of invisible ink, of messages waiting beneath the surface for the conditions that would bring them to light. And I thought of Eleanor's notebooks in the attic trunk, and of Calloway kneeling before them in the cold, and of the letter he had written to Blackwood by the light of his desk lamp, choosing each word with the care of a man who has been reminded, by their temporary absence, of their incalculable worth. What Watson does not say. The brandy was warm in my hand, and the fire was warm at my feet, and the room was warm around me in the way that only a room inhabited by long friendship can be, and I sat in my chair and thought about things I did not say aloud. I thought about the morning that had begun this entire affair. Holmes, standing in the doorway of the sitting room with an expression I had never seen on his face, reaching for the name of the street where we had lived together for 17 years and finding, for one vertiginous instant, nothing. I thought about the carbon disulfide explanation, which was plausible and which I had accepted and which I did not entirely believe. I thought about the way he had handled Calloway's notebook, not as evidence but as something almost sacred, tracing the list of lost words with a tenderness that had told me more about his inner state than any confession could have done. I thought about Eleanor Calloway, losing her language word by word, documenting each loss with the precision and the courage of a woman who refused to let her own dissolution go unrecorded. I thought about Enid Blackwood in her cottage in Woodstock, constructing her intricate, desperate, loving message from the raw materials of another man's vocabulary. I thought about Arthur Fenn, earnest and frightened and young, unable to conceive of a world in which intellectual disputes could carry emotional stakes high enough to drive a woman to such extraordinary measures. And I thought about myself, about the stiffness in my left shoulder where the Jazail bullet had done its work on that long-ago Afghan afternoon, about the reading glasses I now required for even the largest print, about the mornings when I woke with a heaviness in my limbs that no amount of rest seemed to alleviate, and the evenings when I found myself rereading the same paragraph 3 times without retaining its content. I was not old, not yet, not quite, but I was no longer young, and the distance between those two states was narrowing with each passing season, and I had begun to understand, in the quiet, unflinching way that a physician understands such things, that the architecture of the body and the mind is temporary, that all of it, the strength, the sharpness, the reliable retrieval of words and names and faces, is borrowed, not owned, and that the loan, however generous, is not indefinite. I looked across the firelit room at Holmes, at his sharp profile, his half-closed eyes, the smoke rising from his pipe in its slow, meditative spirals, and I felt something I did not name, because naming it would have made it smaller than it was. It was not fear, though fear was a component. It was not sadness, though sadness lived within it. It was something larger and more encompassing, a recognition of the preciousness of the present moment, of this room, of this fire, of this man, sitting across from me in his battered armchair with his pipe and his violin, and his extraordinary, infuriating, irreplaceable mind. A recognition that all of this was finite, and that the finitude was not a reason for grief, but for attention. For the most careful, most grateful, most unwavering attention I was capable of paying. I did not say any of this. I did not need to. Between Holmes and myself, the most important things have always been communicated in silence, in the quality of a glance, in the particular weight of a pause, in the decision to remain in a room when leaving would have been easier. I lifted my brandy and drank, and the warmth of it spread through my chest, like a word finally spoken after years of silence, and I was content. Holmes removed his pipe from his mouth and regarded it with the faintly accusatory expression he reserved for objects that had failed to meet his expectations. "Mrs. Hudson," he announced, "has been interfering with my tobacco supply again. This blend contains an unmistakable note of Latakia that was not present in last week's mixture, suggesting that she has taken it upon herself to supplement my reserves from the shop on Marylebone Road rather than my preferred supplier on the Strand. The Marylebone blend uses a higher proportion of Syrian leaf, which produces a sweeter smoke but a less satisfying finish. I have mentioned this to her on no fewer than 4 occasions." I laughed. I could not help it. After the emotional depths we had navigated over the past 2 days, the lost words, the hidden messages, the trunk in the attic, the letter written by lamplight, the sheer, magnificent ordinariness of Holmes complaining about his tobacco struck me with a force that was partly comic and partly something else entirely. It was a restoration, a return to the surface after a long dive. The reassurance that the world we inhabited, this cluttered, comfortable, beautifully imperfect world of Baker Street, was still here, still solid, still operating according to its own familiar and cherished laws. "I shall speak to her in the morning," I said with a gravity I did not feel. "You will do nothing of the kind. You will agree with her that the Marylebone blend is perfectly adequate, and I shall be forced to make my own arrangements, as I always am in matters of genuine importance." I smiled and let the silence return, and it settled over the room like a blanket drawn up to the chin on a cold night, soft, encompassing, and deeply welcome. Holmes set aside his pipe and reached for his violin. He did not take it to the window, as he sometimes did when performing for an audience of one. Instead, he remained in his chair, cradling the instrument against his shoulder with the casual intimacy of a man holding something he loves, and began to play. Not a recognizable piece, not Bach or Mendelssohn, or any of the compositions he sometimes tackled with more passion than precision. This was something else, something improvised, something searching, a melody that seemed to be discovering itself as it went, feeling its way from note to note with the tentative assurance of a man walking a path he has not traveled before but somehow trusts. The music was quiet. It moved through the room the way firelight moves, not illuminating everything at once but touching surfaces selectively, gently, revealing the texture of things rather than their outlines. I listened, and as I listened, I felt the accumulated weight of the case. The grief, the guilt, the fierce and complicated love that had driven Enid Blackwood to her extraordinary act of linguistic intervention begin to lift from my shoulders and dissolve into the warm air of the sitting room, carried away on notes that had no words and needed none. The fire burned lower. The music grew softer. Baker Street, beyond our windows, had fallen into its own deep quiet. The cabs less frequent now, the lamplighter long since completed in his rounds, the great city settling into sleep with the vast, collective sigh of 8 million souls releasing the day and surrendering to the dark. The violin had gone silent. I was not certain when it had stopped. The transition from music to silence had been so gradual that the two states seemed, for a time, to coexist, the last notes hanging in the warm air like motes of dust in a beam of light, visible only when you were not looking directly at them. The fire had reached its final, most beautiful stage, a bed of embers that glowed with a deep, steady heat, requiring nothing and offering everything, the distilled essence of warmth without the labor of flame. The gas lamps had been turned to their lowest setting, and the sitting room existed now in a kind of luminous dusk, every familiar object softened into suggestion, the hard edges of the day dissolved into the gentle imprecision of approaching sleep. I set down my brandy glass. My journal lay open upon my knee, but I had not written in it for some time. The pen had grown heavy in my hand, and the words, those faithful, indispensable, fragile companions, had begun to retreat to whatever quiet place words go when they are no longer needed, and I let them go without protest because I had learned over the course of this case that the spaces between words are not empty. They are full of everything that language points toward, but cannot quite contain. I thought one last time of Professor Calloway and his list of lost words, of Eleanor and her notebooks, of Enid Blackwood and her fierce, impossible, necessary act of remembrance. And I thought that of all the words Calloway had lost and would soon regain, cathedral, sparrow, longitude, amber, patience, there was one word that perhaps mattered more than any of them. Not a word from the list, not one of the 11 that had been taken and would be restored, but the word that had begun the whole affair, the word that Eleanor had spoken in the garden on a summer afternoon 3 years before her death, the word that had set everything in motion and that had never, despite appearances, been lost at all. The word was promise. And it had never been lost. It had only been buried, waiting beneath the grief like a bulb beneath winter soil, patient and alive and certain that the season would turn and the ground would warm and the green shoot would find its way, as it always does, toward the light. I closed my journal. The lamp was turned low. Baker Street slept, that long, deep, trusting sleep that the city permits itself only in the smallest hours, when even the restless and the watchful surrender at last to the dark. Holmes sat in his chair, his violin resting across his knee, his gray eyes open and contemplative, gazing into the embers with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who finds in the dying fire a text as worthy of study as any cipher or crime scene. He was awake. He would remain awake for some time yet, I knew, his mind turning over the case, or some other case, or some private question whose nature I would never learn and did not need to. He was a sentinel in the darkness, a steady and vigilant presence in the quiet room, and I felt, as I had felt 1,000 times before, and as I would feel, I hoped, 1,000 times again, the old, deep, unshakable safety of knowing that someone was keeping watch. My eyes closed. The fire whispered. The room held me. I slept.